In the previous video, we looked at some ways that we could create Nurbs curves. We saw how we can go to Create, Nurbs Primitives, and select a Nurbs circle, for example. And how we could go to its components, in this case, control vertices, and we could adjust those to change the shape of our Nurbs curve. We also looked at how we could create the same kind of curve from the shelf here under the Curve Surfaces tab. But what if we want to create a Nurbs curve that is more freeform? And that's what we'll take a look at in today's video. To demonstrate this, I'm going to go to my top viewport. And once again, I'm going to go to Create. But this time we'll go to Curve Tools, and we'll be looking at two different tools. We'll look at the CV Curve tool and the EP Curve tool. Let's take a look at the EP Curve tool first. And by selecting that tool, I'm going to click 1, 2, 3, and notice after 3 clicks we start to get a nice sweeping curve. 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. When I've completed my curve, I'll press Enter to complete this action, and here is my Nurbs curve. It is the EP Curve tool that we used. And if I right-click on it to look at the components, you'll notice that we have edit points. That's why this was called the EP Curve tool, because I was creating edit points. If I select that, each one of these edit points is where I clicked to create this curve. And I can move these edit points. However, I can still go also to the control vertex components, and I can move them as well. Let's take a look at the CV Curve tool this time. Once again, I'll go to Create, Curve Tools, but this time I'll select the CV Curve tool. And I'll click 1, 2, 3, 4. Notice that now I'm starting to get a nice smooth curve after 4 clicks. And I can continue clicking to extend my curve. Now notice that the curve does not run through the CV curve points. That's how the curve vertices work. Once again, when I want to complete my curve, I will press Enter. I can go to its edit points, which lay directly on the curve, or I can go to the control vertices, which is what I used to create this curve. The fact is that both the EP Curve tool and the CV Curve tool create the same kind of curve. They're no different from one another. The only difference is the way that you create them. You'll remember in my previous video that I said that Nurbs curves actually do not render. So you might be wondering, well, then what use are they? Well, we can use these Nurbs curves to create geometry, either Nurbs surfaces or polygon meshes. Let's take a look at that. I'm going to go to my object mode here, and I'm going to delete these. We don't need them anymore. And I'm going to switch over to my front viewport for this demonstration. Once again, I'm going to go to Create, Curve Tools, and I'm going to use the CV Curve tool. Frankly, I find this one easier to use than the EP Curve tool. And I'm going to click right at the origin here on the grid, And maybe to make sure I do that, I'll turn on Snap to Grid. Snap to Grid can be found here. I'm going to click 1, 2, so I've got 3 points so far. And I'll click a 4th point here. And this will be my Nurbs curve. Now what I'm going to do is go to my component mode and I will select Control Vertex. And maybe I'll just adjust these. Let me turn off Snap to Grid now. I'll just adjust them to make this corner here a little sharper. I'll just make some quick fine-tune adjustments to my curve. And I think that's pretty good. So let's see how we can now use this Nurbs curve to create a surface. I'm going to go to Object Mode, and here we can take a look at the curve in my perspective view. One thing to keep in mind, something very important here, is that my pivot point is right here in the center of my world space. Why is this important? Well, let's take a look. With my curve selected, I'm going to go to Surfaces, Revolve, and I get this bottle shape. Let's take a look at this a little bit more. I'm going to move this bottle over here so that you can see both my geometry here as well as the curve that I used to create this from. Now, remember, I created the curve and then we did a revolve on it. What did we do? Well, we revolved it to create a surface, and it revolved around this axis here, around the y-axis. In fact, if I select the geometry here and go to the inputs, you'll notice that axis X, Y, and Z are set to 0, 1, and 0, meaning that it has been revolved around the y-axis. If I were to revolve it around the x-axis instead, which would be this axis here, I'll get a very different result. Let's see what happens. I'm going to take axis X, change that to 1, and I'll change axis Y and change that to 0. And you'll see that that revolve gives me something a little more like a plate. I'm going to switch it back. Another interesting thing about this technique is what is called history. And that's what we're looking at here, basically, with the inputs. This revolve 1 is history on this object here. Normally, I tell my students that they should periodically delete history, and in most cases, this is true. However, there are times when history is beneficial to have while you're still in the modeling stage. And let's take a look at that. If I select my Nurbs curve, because this bottle has history on it still, it is still dependent on this curve. In fact, if I go to its components, control vertices for example, and I adjust the curve, you'll notice that my geometry updates. And I can make it into a very different form if I wish. For instance, instead of a bottle, perhaps it's a jug. I'm going to go back to my object mode for this curve, and let's take a look at what happens if I move the curve off of the center. It's still revolving from this point, so we end up with a hole in the center, and we end up with this very different form. I'm going to move it back. A couple other things I want to point out. If I select this object itself, this is actually a Nurbs object. It's Nurbs geometry. In fact, if I go to the control vertices, you'll notice that it's very different than a polygon mesh. It behaves very differently. At some point, I messed up my curve here. I'm going to fix that really quickly, but that's one of the beauties of working with history. Let me go to control vertex, and I'm just going to take these two control vertices that somehow, I'm not sure when I did this, but I moved them off the center here. I'll just turn on snap to grid, and that'll make my geometry look a little neater because I still have history on it. Now, one thing that, again, I want you to be aware of is that this is not a polygon object. But in most cases, you're going to probably want to work with polygon objects. And there's a couple different ways that we can make it into a polygon object. One way, with my Nurbs geometry selected, I'm going to go to Modify, Convert Nurbs to Polygons. And that'll take my Nurbs object and it'll make a polygon object from it. I'm going to open up the settings for it, and I'm going to show you my preferred settings. Right now, if I go to Edit, Reset Settings, just to make sure it's at the default settings, and we can apply, and you'll see that I get this geometry. I don't really like this very much. This would be a little difficult to work with as a polygon object, but if we right-click on it, you'll notice that it is, in fact, a polygon object. It has faces, it has vertices, and so on. The setting I prefer when converting an object from Nurbs to polygons is control points. So I will select that. With my geometry selected, I will apply, and I get this. Okay, this is not exactly what I desired, but that's okay, because what I can do now is go to my modeling toolkit and apply a mesh smooth to it, and you'll see that I get something now that more approximates this nice smooth jug. In fact, I can up the divisions on this or decrease them to get it at the resolution that I want. Another way that I could generate polygon geometry rather than Nurbs geometry is to select my curve. Once again, go to Surfaces, Revolve, but I'll open up its options. And instead of having the output geometry set to Nurbs, I will change it to Polygons. I'll get those same selections that I had when I converted this other one to a polygon object. If you remember, I like to set it to control points. I'll apply. And once again, I get this geometry. However, if I do a mesh smooth on it, maybe add some divisions, I get the form that I desire. Almost. We've got one little problem here. It's not a big problem. However, my normals are reversed. Instead of pointing outward, they're pointing inward. A very simple fix. I'll select my polygon geometry. I will go to Mesh Display. and I will reverse it. All these objects still have history on them. In fact, if I come in here and start changing the form, you'll notice that they all update. And now I have something maybe a little more like a beaker. Let's say that I don't want them to have history any longer. Or let's just say I don't want this one to have history on it any longer. What I can do is select it and go to Edit, Delete by Type History. Now you'll notice that this one has the history of the Nurbs and the Polygon Smooth Face. This one also has this history. This one does not. Now, if I come over here to this Nurbs curve and I start adjusting it, these two will still update. This one will not because I deleted history on it. Before moving on, I want to just emphasize one important thing. I'm going to delete this geometry here. I'm going to select my curve and I'm going to press the Insert key or the D key to move my curve's pivot point, and I'll move it over here. And I'll press Insert or the D key to get out of that Move Pivot mode. What happens if I revolve this curve now? I'll go to Surfaces, Revolve. Remember that I currently have it set to polygons. I'm going to go ahead and switch it back to Nurbs, however. Remember, you can always take your Nurbs objects and convert them to polygons later. And I'll apply. And what you'll notice is that it is revolving from the curve's pivot point. And the pivot point is over here, which is why we get this shape and not that more kind of beaker or bottle-like form. If I wish to move that pivot point back so that it revolves around the right point on the curve, and then I do another revolve, I get the surface that I want. So remember, pivot points are important. We'll go through the steps one more time very quickly. I want to show you a practical example where I might use this technique to create something very exact. And to demonstrate this, I'm going to go to my front viewport. I will go to View, Image Plane, Import Image. And I will find a picture of a vase that I took. Let's say I want to model this form here. So I'm going to use this image as an image plane. Now when I work with image planes, I typically like to pull the image plane off the center. And I like to bring down the alpha gain. And I tell it to look through camera so that I only see my image plane in the viewport that it is associated with. Oftentimes, I'll also like to put it onto a layer so that I can quickly hide and unhide it, as well as making it unselectable so I don't accidentally select it and move it. So now I have my image plane, and I will go to Create, Curve Tools, CV Curve Tool. And I will start drawing out this form. Now, typically when I'm trying to draw out a form, I try to use as few points as possible. This makes working with it easier. And I'll be demonstrating some of these techniques for getting very exact curves in a later video. Notice I'm not worried that this isn't conforming to it exactly right now. I'll go into component mode later on and fine tune it. Here's my curve. If I switch over to component mode, I can adjust the components to describe the form a little bit more exactly. And I think that's probably pretty good. Here's my curve. I'll go to object mode, surfaces, revolve. Now, I don't need to open up the options here, but I do want to point out that you can change them here. You can tell it what axis to revolve around. For this example, I want it to revolve around the y-axis, this axis here, so I'm going to leave it at that setting and I will apply. Remember that I'm creating a Nurbs surface here, and here is my vase. I'll move it off to the side, and you can see that it describes that form pretty well. Once again, remember that this is actually a Nurbs surface. The benefit of Nurbs surfaces as opposed to polygon surfaces is that you can get nice smooth forms with less geometry, in this case, less control vertices as opposed to vertices in a polygon mesh. But if I need a polygon mesh, and in most cases that's what you're going to need, remember that you can always go to Modify, Convert, Nurbs to Polygons, open up the options, make sure that you have it set to control points, and apply. Now with this form, remember that if I want it to be a little bit more accurate and more like my actual vase or more like my Nurbs surface, I can select it and I can go to Smooth. And there it is. Before finishing up this video, I'll just show you a couple other things very, very quickly. And one of those, again, just to reemphasize, if I don't want to keep history any longer, and let's say I don't really want it to update anymore, I can delete history on it. So with my vase selected, I'm going to go to Edit, Delete, delete by type history. That'll get rid of that history. Now, when I work with this curve, it'll update on this surface. It will not update on this surface any longer. A couple other things I'd like to show. Because I moved this off center when I created it, you'll notice that its pivot point is actually no longer in the center. This is really not desirable because if I were to rotate this vase, it's rotating from here. Very, very simple fix. I can either move my pivot point manually by pressing the D key or the insert key, or in this case, it's a little more simple to just go to Modify, Center Pivot, and it'll put the pivot right in the center of the object. And one other thing. Notice that if I go to Shading and turn on what is called Backface Culling, you'll notice that, in fact, it only has one side that renders. This side does not render. You can see it still exists, but we see right through it. And most vases, or vases if you prefer, are not paper thin like this one here. So I think what I will do with this selected is go to my modeling toolkit and I'll extrude the whole form. I'll pull out on the blue arrow, the Z axis. Actually, rather than pulling out, I'm going to bring it in. This creates another problem, again with the normals not facing the right direction. But very quick and easy fix. I'll select the vase, go to Mesh Display, Reverse. And here is my vase now. It has some thickness and it has an interior. And that's that for this video. In the next video, I'll show you a little bit more about how you can really get fine control of the Nurbs curves that you draw so that you can get nice sweeping smooth curves as well as sharp angles.